Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions, with your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a management consultancy that helps higher ed leaders transform their institutions through holistic approaches to accreditation, institutional governance, strategic planning and implementation, university academics and operations, change management, leadership and culture, and marketing, positioning, and branding. Now here's your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton.
Our guest today is Russ Poulin, the Executive Director of WCET, the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education Center for Education Technology. Russ has a long history in distance and online education, having coordinated distance education activities for the North Dakota University system before joining WCET. Russ has represented the distance education community in the U.S. Department of Education's 2014 and 2019 negotiated rulemaking process, and he's here to talk to us today about that latter process, which just wrapped up. Russ, great to have you back on the show. Thanks for taking some time with us today.
Oh, it's so great to be here with you.
You've had quite the year between the negotiated rulemaking starting off. You got yourself a very nice promotion there at WICHE. Congratulations on that.
Thank you very much. It's great to be the Executive Director of WCET. Yes.
Well, you've done such a fabulous job there. They're really lucky to have you. Let's get started. Neg Reg 2019. Big thing that happened, consensus across the board, and the first part of that was published in the Federal Register by November 1st, so it goes into effect by July 1st. What are some of the big takeaways from that?
Yes, yeah. And just to remind everyone, I did serve on the subcommittee on the negotiated rulemaking, so I didn't have a final vote, that we did have a lot of input about what the full committee was looking at and what they did finally vote on. And he said that they did come to consensus and agreed on all these rules, and so that was interesting. And so they are going to release the rules in three different packets or buckets that are coming out. And the first one that just came out at the end of October, start of November, focused on state authorization for distance education and on accreditation. And so I'll get some highlights on both of those, if that's great.
Yeah, that would be great to hear. What do you see are the most relevant ones?
Yeah, and then the state authorization, that one that finally got through, it has to do with officially tying federal financial aid to an institution having the approval of the state where it is serving students. And so that is something where I think that that actually went in earlier this year in May, but that it was really solidified with these regulations coming out. And it is something where I think that some of the institutions who have been putting off complying with state authorization were waiting for that tie to federal financial aid. And so it's here. So they better make sure that they have those approvals in the states where they're serving students.
And that goes right to the NC SARA, does it not?
It does, yeah. And so one of the ways to help with that is with reciprocity. So you have the National Council for State Authorization Reciprocity Agreement, NC SARA. And another thing that was in there was their definition. And in that, this was a controversial part of it, that they did change one thing in the definition of reciprocity, so that before there was some language in there that made it look like a state could enforce pretty much any rule that it wanted to on top of being part of the reciprocity. And of course, the problem with that is that it's not really reciprocity if everybody still enforces the same rules that they had. And so I know some were upset with that change, but I welcome it, because without it, that you really don't have reciprocity. But if an institution is a member or is a participant in SARA, that should help them out, get them quite a ways down the line to be in compliance with that first issue.
Except with California.
Except, yeah, California is not a member, and a couple of the islands. We're working on the islands, trying to get them in, and so we're working on that. And in California, hard to say when they will ever get in. Not anytime soon.
Well, I'm optimistic about that. Laurie Williams, she was the former provost at Ashford and then went over to WASC and was one of the liaisons to the universities. She just took the executive director, CEO position there. And I'm optimistic that with her experience in California higher ed, that she may have some influence and be able to get them on board.
Yeah, it's great to have her in that role, and yeah, I wish her luck and hope that we can get that moving forward.
It certainly would make it a lot easier for universities who really want to be able to go into California, tap into some of their students, and it makes the whole authorization for state much easier.
Well, and from the other side, that for the institutions in California who are going out, that they're spending quite a lot of money if they're having to get authorized individually in each of the different states, and then also there's and there's really one of the issues that came up this summer is that there really is very little protection in California for students at nonprofits or public institutions if they're located in California and taking courses from an out-of-state institution at a distance. That there is just now a complaint process, but I'm not sure how much that will do. But there's little else in terms of being able to provide an alternative consumer protection for those students, since that's another issue.
Absolutely. So back to the Neg Reg, it really strengthened the triad, did it not? The state, the federal, and the accreditation bodies, didn't it?
Yeah, it really did. There was a lot of focus in terms of maybe in the past there had been some interest in terms of having the accreditors really serve as a almost sort of a quasi regulatory agency for on behalf of the department. And there was a lot of ideas about sort of pulling back on that. The department really wanted to do that and put a lot of trust in terms of the accreditors and what they are doing in terms of working with institutions, and so that we saw quite a few issues with that. I'm going to focus more on in our area, and what I was commenting on is more on the ed tech distance ed ones. But I know that there's a lot of other changes in terms of accreditations that certainly campus leaders, presidents should be looking at to make sure that they're in line with the changes that will be coming down the road from their institutional accrediting agency. And so first one has to do with this whole notion of regional versus national accreditation. We're still trying to get our hands around this one because they've really taken region out of the scope for accrediting agencies, and so they are all now, there's no longer that distinction from the department's point of view about national versus regional accreditation. They're all just institutional accreditors. What impact that will have will be interesting, because there was a lot of interest from the department in terms of making sure that all institutions, whether they're regionally or nationally accredited, were treated the same, and that there are some institutions in transfer or some state agencies that treat them differently. And so we'll see how that plays out going forward. So that's something for presidents really to look out for.
That's a major thing. I know they've talked about that for many years, but to actually put that down to where you're not a regional or a national, you're just an accrediting body, that can be huge. One of the other things I believe they did was, instead of keeping the regionals in their lanes, i.e., for instance, WASC just being California and the islands, they can go outside of their lanes now and accredit anybody in any state.
Yes, yeah, that's part of being, essentially a national accreditor. And one of the things that they pointed out about that is that one of the regional accreditors provided a map of where all the activities are of the institutions that they accredit. And so, what happens by the time you get branch campuses and additional locations, which is another phrase that they defined this time, which was great that they'd been using this term for years and had never defined it, and now they've defined it. Yay, that's good. But by the time the regional accreditor includes all those other things that they're overseeing, that the regional accreditor was essentially in almost all 50 states anyway. So they were looking at that and saying, so that they allowed them to move beyond their own states that they typically were in.
Hmm. Yeah, I know HLC has got a huge reach in what they do, and I know their initial thing was, okay, you can have no more than X number of states and no less than three states. And there was a significant amount of pushback from HLC.
Yes, yeah, and to think that there's yeah, and the whole notion of region, HLC goes from West Virginia to Arizona to North Dakota. That's a pretty big pretty big region, and so it will. So we've heard some things about that there's interest in trying to make it so that it's a level playing field for other. Also heard some things about, well, they're not going to really push it that much. It'll be interesting to see exactly what happens in terms of how the accrediting agencies react to this, and also what the department does in terms of any sort of oversight or what they're going to do in terms of pushing that forward.
And it makes perfect sense from a student's perspective. You've had regionals in some schools which are regionally accredited who would not accept transfer credits from nationally accredited schools.
Right.
So this one language here could not definitely would, but could remedy that. We'll see.
That is something that was cited by the department in trying to push this forward. So that could be a big issue and could be controversial at several institutions about whether to accept those national accrediting agencies. And I know some of the national accrediting agencies have criteria that are really quite strong. Others maybe not so much. But one maybe could say that for the regionals as well. But yeah, we'll see where that goes.
Yeah. What are some of the other things that come to mind that are important for university presidents?
Well, something else to look at that's been a little bit unclear. This has to do with distance ed students, and that they've changed just slightly the definition of around student identity. Now, the idea all along was that institution is supposed to make sure that the student who registers for the course is the same one who's taking any sort of assessment, a test, or writing papers or such. And what they did is that before that there was some examples in there in terms of having a password or using face-to-face proctoring, or the third thing was any other electronic thing, which was very broad. And that what institutions and sometimes the accreditors who are overseeing them did was they said, oh, they have a password. Well, that's good enough. Well, they took out those examples. And I think this is going back to what we were talking about before about leaning on the accreditors more, is that they would like to see the accreditor work with the institution to say, okay, what really is working there, and what evidence do you have that is working now? So that could strengthen it, and that may mean for some changes at institutions. Another part of this, though, is that I have seen a few vendors who have said, "Oh, that means you need to buy our product." Well, it doesn't mean you need to buy their product, right? Or you can't, or by taking it out that you can't use face-to-face proctoring. That is definitely not what they meant, because we asked that question, and the department in their responses said, "No, that is not what we meant." So we know that's the case because we asked and they answered on that. So that's one that may be a little confusing to people.
Sure. Uh, another one is substantial interaction. Wasn't that one of the key things that came up?
Well, it was, and it did not come out in this package, but it did lead to something that did come out in this package. And so, in the definition of distance education, which was uh, last changed in 1992, and I believe a few things have changed since then.
You think?
Yeah, I think so. That there was this idea of regular and substantive interaction, and one of the problems with that was that it was sort of defined, but not really fully defined in a functional way for institutions to know what to do. So, and I, so what would happen would be there would be these reviews, either by federal financial aid uh, uh, reviews or audits, or by the Office of Inspector General, and that every time they did it, that the criteria were slightly different. And so what is an institution supposed to do in terms of being compliant with that, or what are they supposed to be telling their faculty to do. So it's been a problem for a while with that. And so, we should have interaction, although the definition of interaction that got used was more, it was all, the only things that counted were what came from the faculty member. Well, that's not interaction. If it's just Drum or just Russ talking the whole time, we're not interacting, right? And so there was lots of information, lots of progress that was made in terms of updating that. While that language was not in the regulations that were just released, we're expecting that to come out probably fairly soon for comment, probably in the next few, either late 2019 or early 2020. But it did lead to one other thing that is in this package, and that is that there was some flexibility given for accreditors to allow for some innovation that maybe is in place now, or the thing we know for sure is that 5 years from now there'll be some innovation that we can't even think of right now. And so the accreditor is given some leeway so that as long as they're following to make sure that students aren't harmed, and that there's some evidence around that, and that it seems like students are doing well, that there's some leeway for that to happen with the campus, as long as the accreditor is keeping watch on that. And the reason that happened is that something like competency-based education. And so I went round and round with several other people trying to come up with a definition of regular for something like competency-based, which is by definition irregular, right? Because the whole idea is that the student does it when the student does it, and or progresses at their own pace. And so there's very little regularity to that. And so while they couldn't change that regular word because it's in statute, that this additional flexibility is in the accreditation guidelines that just came out, or accreditation regulations, I should say, that just came out. And it'll be interesting to see what use the accreditors make of that going forward.
Well, I think you hit on something that's really key, is 5 years from now, there's going to be other things that come out that we haven't even thought of right now. And for the accreditors to be able to have the flexibility to say, yeah, go give it a try, just make sure you're looking for good student outcomes with it, I think is critical.
Yeah, I think so too, because remember, I said the distance education definition didn't change since 1992. Well, let's put that forward. If we're saying that we're next going to change it in 2047, a few things are going to happen between now and then that we're not anticipating right now.
Most definitely. And it's kind of crazy, because one of the hacks on distance ed has been the substantial interaction and are you a correspondence course? And then you get into the whole thing versus, CBE versus credit hour. Is credit hour really a good measure of learning? Which we all know it isn't. It's just it's a proxy. And
Right,
so,
right. Yeah, and when I've criticized the interaction regulations that people have mistaken my meaning, is that it's not that I'm against interaction within these distance ed courses. It's very important. I'm actually for interaction. The definition as it was being applied again was one way. What did the faculty person do? There's very interesting things that are being done in terms of what the faculty is doing with the student to student interaction, and even more so student to content or computer type of interaction, at what's happening there. We're seeing some very interesting things there. And how does that happen? And then as we're one of the things that ended up being an issue for Western Governors University and all this issue too was that they use a unbundled faculty model. So it might be a different person who's doing the assessment than is doing the teaching, and so but then that person who's doing the assessment didn't count in all of that, and so there was some leeway in this in terms of how the accreditors would define the faculty and the faculty role.
mm-hmm. Are there any other key things that we need to look at on this first package, or should we move on to the second and the third?
But one thing that was in state authorization regulations that is quite different. Is that this idea of for institutions that offer degree programs that lead to professional licensure, so nursing, psychology, teaching, those sorts of things. That in the past, the regulation was looking at that if you were doing that at a distance, that you notify the student in that other state that does my nursing program, we'll pick on nursing, does it fulfill the educational requirements in that other state? And that had been around but not fully implemented until just recently. And that was kept. However, in these negotiations, what happened is that was expanded to all programs, whether face to face or at a distance. So if even if the student is going from Iowa to New Jersey, that New Jersey institution has to provide some information about does it meet the educational requirements for whatever that profession is in the other states. And so there's still some confusion around that. It's going to be a big lift for a bit in terms of the institutions getting up to speed in terms of researching and getting that out there. But it's really something that presidents are going to have to be looking at because it's not just distance ed, it's the whole institution.
Well, that's huge because now California, I shouldn't use California, say a New Mexico institution, if they're training students from New Jersey or Colorado, then they need to be aware of what those requirements are so the degree can go toward that state licensure. That's huge.
It is, yes. And again, and it's just the educational requirements. And they are allowed to make three different types of statements. One is that they know it meets the that they know that what they offer does meet the requirements in New Mexico, they know it does not meet the requirements, or the third is that they were unable to make a determination. And that would be either that they did not look, or sometimes you're an institution, you're trying to do it, and the state agency doesn't respond to you. And so what are you supposed to do with that? And so they allowed for that third category on there.
Well, that never happens, the state not getting back to you.
These are very busy people, and I do respect them, but they're going to get a lot of calls from a lot of institutions, so it's going to take a while for them to get through all those calls.
And in some ways, it puts an additional burden, or it could put an additional burden on the accreditation bodies, because if they're looking at approving a new program, substantive change, for example, are they going to be asking the questions, especially from a distance education, does this meet state requirements for other states?
Yeah, and that could happen both in accreditation and then also the states have their own rules around this too, so they could be looking at that as well. And then now it could be part of a federal review. Are you checking to see whether you meet those? And all of this is our whole subcommittee supported this because we thought it was an important consumer protection.
I fully agree. Let's swap horses here and head over to the other packages that were not approved. You said there were two of those.
Yeah, and so where those are at is that they're still working on the packaging around that, and that they're thinking about those. Because one of the things that they have to do, even though they're supposed to publish uh, what is agreed upon through the committee, that they do have to check through every bit of language. First of all, for English, to make sure it still makes sense, because sometimes in the draft of Hastings, I was there, that things don't. You have all the comments and do the words make sense? That's one. Second is that does it conflict with other parts of law? And so they're looking through all those things, and I'm glad that the department's doing their due diligence on those things. But there are so coming out. What will happen will be two more packages. They'll come out for comment fairly soon in the next few months. They'll probably be 30 to 60 days for comment, and then they have to respond to the comments, and the final regulations will come out from that. And then so I know that some of the issues that involve with that, or the Teach Act, that there's some necessary changes required for that, and I think there was some good progress they made there. There were some changes around religious affiliated institutions, and there was some controversy and differences of opinion about what should happen there. I did not pay as much attention to that. And then there's still a whole bunch of other regulations that have to do with this is probably where the distance education regulation will be probably in this other package, as well as a lot of other definitions and other issues around federal financial aid. There are a lot of things around, for example, around competency-based education, and where they couldn't define it, but there's some direct assessment is the term as an alternative form of federal financial aid that could be used for competency-based education. That there were some ways where they made that a little bit simpler, because they came up with some regulations a few years ago, but they were so complex that I think it was 7 institutions actually did that. So they're trying to make that as a more attractive alternative. And so, and then there's several other fixes to some things around federal financial aid that will be coming out with that package as well.
That'll be good. And the title of those 2 packages are?
Well, we don't know exactly what will be in what package. Our guess is, would be that the Teach Act and the religiously affiliated will probably be in one. For some reason, that they were sort of bundled together. They were in separate subcommittees, but they were kind of bundled together when the full committee looked at it. And then all these other things have more to do with the federal financial aid and what's happening there. And so it'll probably be something along those lines around.
So the first package will be named Teach Religious, and the second will be Cats and Dogs. Is that it?
I think that's right. Or everything that's left, I guess, that it goes into that one. And if they did something completely different, I've been so bad at predicting what the department will do. They could do something completely different. So there you go.
I understand completely. So Russ, 3 takeaways for our listeners.
Well, yeah, the 3 takeaways is that one is that really I mentioned a couple things around accreditation, but really there's a lot of things around substantive change and other issues around accreditation that are not just now. The accreditors are dealing with how are they going to do, what are they going to do, and what are they going to expect the institutions be watching those. State authorization is tied to federal aid. So if you've been one of those that have been waiting, you better get on board and make sure you have the approvals in the state. And the third one is that expansion on the professional licensure notification. That's going to be a big lift in terms of making sure that whether your programs, and you might have a lot of programs at a big institution, meet those educational requirements in those different states.
That's great. And I would fully expect, based on this latest rules that came out, that we're going to start seeing some changes from the accreditors on the standards that they have. That would be my bet.
Definitely. That it's going to take them a little while. They've known about these, and I think they've been talking about them, but they've been waiting for the final regulations to act. And so I think we'll see over the next several months that one by one they'll start coming out with here's how we're interpreting them, here's what we'll do, here's what we'll expect.
That sounds great. Well, Russ, it's always a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for making the time. And
yes, thank you so much. Yes, thanks. And always great being with you.
Thank you, sir. Take care. Thanks for listening this week. And a special thank you to this week's special guest, Russ Poulin, who spoke with us about Neg Reg 2019 and the ways that it will impact higher ed going forward. Our next episode will be our traditional end of the year, where Deb Maui and I will explore what's gone on in higher education in 2019, and we'll have a few prognostications about what we think will happen in 2020. Thanks for listening, and look forward to hearing from you next week.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, an organization committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode, at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drum McNaughton. Post-production by David L. White.